Welcome to What the Big Book is Actually Saying for Steps 8 and 9, Part 1. Hang on a second, I'm sure you're thinking, why aren't you just doing Step 8 and then Step 9? It's because this section of the Big Book doesn't work that way. It works in a two-part way, in my view, but not Step 8 and 9 exclusively. Let me explain. Both the Big Book and the 12 and 12, our two principal instructional texts, introduce steps 8 and 9 together. This indicates that the way we are encouraged to perceive and action them, we need to see them as a combo deal. So you can read here how that works. Now we need more action, it says in the Big Book, without which we find faith without works is dead. Let's look at steps 8 and 9. Then in the opening section of the Step 8 chapter in the 12 and 12, in fact, the very first sentence, Steps 8 and 9 are concerned with personal relationships. So there's this suggestion to separate Step 8 and 9 in terms of how we action them just doesn't work. And that's been my experience. And in the conversations I've had with many members, it's also been theirs. So what we also get if we go back to the Big Book quote is this constant reinforcement after having taken step 3. We need to get off our backsides and do work. We need to keep proving to ourselves and perhaps others, and certainly to our higher power, that we did turn a corner. We were all in. We were willing to go to any length to get sober when we took step 3. And that commitment to step 3 is reiterated in this part of the Big Book. In fact, it's reiterated quite consistently between steps 4 and 9. So let's keep going. This is the first section of steps 8 and 9 in the Big Book. But really what you can see highlighted in purple is that we're reviewing, or at least being asked to reflect on, previously taken steps. It starts with a step 4 review. We have a list of all persons we have harmed and to whom we are willing to make amends. We made it when we took inventory. Now, I think I alluded to this in the step 4 videos, that suggestion is sort of kind of there at step 4, but it could be a lot more prominent. If they ever rewrite the Big Book, I think it would be nice to have a section in the step 4 part of the book that just says, make a list of everyone you harmed, whether there was a resentment or a fear or a sex conduct issue involved or not. That would be very handy. Anyway, it's a moot point because we can catch it here. Then we review steps 4 to 7. We subjected ourselves to a drastic self-appraisal. Now, some people would say, well, that's just step 4. But in fact, when you look at the way we do steps 4 through to 7, we're constantly deepening and widening our self-appraisal. I mean, steps 6 and 7, for example, are about asking, have I done enough work? Am I still all in with the commitment I took at step 3? Am I ready to take this step 7 prayer super seriously? Reiterating what I prayed about at step 3, but in a more specific, immediate, action-oriented, spiritually aware way. Then it reads on, now we go out to our fellows and repair the damage done in the past. Now we know exactly what that damage is. We attempt to sweep away the debris which has accumulated. And then we get to a step 3 review. Out of our effort to live on self-will and run the show ourselves. There's an exact connection via the idea of running the show back to that section of the Big Book, which is, step 3. If we haven't the will to do this, we ask until it comes. Remember, it was agreed at the beginning we would go to any lengths for victory over alcohol. This is all reiterating that commitment, that incredibly vital commitment we made at step 3, which we recommitted to when we took the step 7 prayer, which was the very last thing we did prior to reading this part of the Big Book. So there's this harking back and reminding that the structure of the Big Book gives us to keep us on point and on track because, let's face it, doing an amends seems very different than writing down inventory, which we can do alone. Anyway, this agreement is mentioned regularly between steps 4 to 8 and 9. Okay, so I put that in there to remind myself to say it, but I'd already said it. Okay, let's read on. Probably there are still some misgivings. Duh. As we look over the list of business acquaintances and friends we have hurt, we may feel diffident about going to some of them on a spiritual basis. Let us be reassured, to some people we need not and probably should not emphasise the spiritual feature on our first approach. We might prejudice them. At the moment, we are trying to put our lives in order, but this is not an end in itself. Our real purpose is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. That's a lot of information. And now we're starting to talk about sharing our spirituality, going to people via our amends on a spirit. What does that mean? So let's have a go at modernising this. And note, this is just my take, but this is something that, sponsors do with their sponsees. What does that mean? Well, let me rephrase that. Here's how I would do that. Probably you're not that keen on making an amends. Again, duh. Well, maybe you are, who knows? I wasn't super keen. It seemed a bit scary. As we look over the list of people we have hurt, we may feel uncomfortable about going to some of them because we are doing the steps. Let us be reassured, to some people we need not and probably should not push this massively on our first approach, this idea of doing the steps. We might make them feel uncomfortable. At the moment, we are trying to put our lives in order, but this is not an end in itself. Our real purpose is to keep on track with being of maximum service to God and the people about us. So there's this, whichever way you read it, whether it's the original way or this updated way, it all goes back to that part of the doctor's opinion where, it states that we get sober via spiritual, as well as altruistic means. And it's kind of reiterated here. You need to help people around us, be of service to people around us and to God. So it's the spiritual and the altruistic coming together. Okay. Now, in this next part of the big book, and I'm sort of paraphrasing a bit because there's a whole other set of sentences about why we shouldn't go to people and talk about God too much, which is probably not as big a deal these days as it was back then. And I get a sense of that because I've never heard anyone share at a steps meeting when we get to steps 8 or 9, a burning desire to talk about God with the people they need to make amends to. It just seems to be something that's perhaps dropped out of favour. Anyway, we have this interesting scenario. We got this sentence in the big book: the question of how to approach the man, woman, or person we hated will arise. Now, what's interesting is, and you can see here in purple, note, the next section of the big book gives very specific advice as to how to make amends to people we hate. No general advice, however, as to how to make an amends to a non-enemy is provided. This enemy-related advice, therefore, is all we have to refer to prepare for, structure and conduct an amends. The how-to part of sitting down with someone and making an amends. It's up to you to refer to it when making an amends to a person you didn't or don't hate. So what I'm saying is there is literally, okay, here are 7 steps to making an amends with anyone. That is not mentioned in the big book, but there is some very specific advice around getting over the discomfort of sitting down with someone you don't like. Now, what I tend to do is make all of my amends that way, whether this person is an enemy to me or not, someone I hate or not. It doesn't matter. I always use the suggestions. It works great! Exclamation mark. I have even memorized the suggestion via an acronym, and the acronym is Amends. So what I'm saying is here are the 6 top suggestions from this section of the big book in my view. And I've captured them under the acronym Amends to remind myself of their importance. And I'll say it one more time. I do this every time I make an amends, and it's always gone well. When I don't use the suggestions for making an amends to an enemy, it tends to not go well. I've actually made an amends for making an amends to someone. I was at a social function, work-related. She was a peer who I'd harmed in my drinking days, and I wished to. We very rarely saw each other, so I thought, oh, here's a great chance to make an amends. And this was 15 minutes before we were all going in to hear a lecture, and so I kind of pushed the person she was talking to the side as politely as I could, and said, "Have you got 5 minutes? I need to make an amends to you. I'm in AA now," and blah 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 blah. And it was like such an abrasive thing. I could see she was freaking out. Later on, a couple of months later, when I saw her again, I made an amends for how I made the first amends. So my suggestion is stick to the script, or at least the suggestions in the big book, enemy or not. But that's just my suggestion. It's not suggested in the big book. I want to make that clear. Okay, let's look at each of the 6 suggestions. The first is alcoholic. A is for alcoholic. And this is a quote from the big book. Simply, we tell him, her, them, that we will never get over drinking until we have done our utmost to straighten out the past. So what we're being told here is to share with our enemy, and I would suggest with anyone we're making amends to, that we're never going to get over our drinking until we straighten things out. Now, the way I put it in 2022 is this. I'm in AA. You probably know already that I had a drinking problem, and I still do, but at least I'm trying to work it out. At step 8, we're asked to make a list of all the people we've harmed. Drunk or sober, you made the list. And they usually go, well, they give me some recognition. It could be a nod or an utterance. Yeah, fair enough. They're in. They're open to the amends. It's a really important thing that I share why I'm making the amends. It's part of our steps. Most people I've made amends to are very aware of AA and the 12 steps, probably from movies and television. So I think it's easier to do this first suggestion now than back in the day when no one knew about AA when the book was first published. M is for manner. It says on page 78. And I love the fact that we're given a way to be when we sit down with someone. If our manner is calm, frank, and open, we will be gratified with the result. Calm, frank, and open. I know 2 people in the rooms who are named Frank. That's their name. And they're both very calm and open people. So sometimes I can take frank to be the dictionary definition, or just think about either of the 2 real Franks I know, and I become these words. So I use these words as trigger words to walk into the amends, and they work very well for me. So my walk, my energy, my sentence length, all of these things, my tone of voice, my volume, they're all framed by these 3 words: calm, frank, and open. It works really well. E, what does E stand for? Express regret. So this is just the end of one sentence, and I'll show you the front of that sentence later on in another one of our letters. But it ends this sentence and expressing our regret. So you'll hear in the rooms I have, perhaps, that we don't say I'm sorry. It's one of the things we used to say when we were trying to make an amends before we got spiritual. I actually use that as dialogue. So when I make an amends to someone, I usually, and this could be in written or verbal form, I want to express regret for blah, blah, blah. Or blah, 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 and look, I want to express regret for that. It's a very powerful term. It has a thoughtfulness about it. And regret is not sorrow. Regret is not like, I want to apologize. It's a deeper thing. It has that, not grandeur, but sense of solidity that I've thought about this. I'm regretful. And because it's got the word express, going back to being calm, frank, and open, I can be sincere. I can be open about how I feel about things. For some reason, when I say the word regret, it feels different than I'm sorry or I apologize. It's easier for me to be authentically regretful. I can't explain why, but it's a very, very effective turn of phrase that I find works really well. And it's in the big book, so why not be literal? What does N stand for? N stands for no payback. It's this marvelous little sentence. Under no condition do we criticise such a person or argue. And doesn't that hark back to the fourth step of the resentment inventory, the fourth step of the fourth step, where we're asked to pray for someone we dislike as if they're sick, not bad. And that really links to this moment. So obviously, we have this clear suggestion. It's not about arguing again. It's about looking at our side of the street. D stands for defects of character or flaws, shortcomings, whichever word you wish. It says this: there are two references to the idea of admitting faults. By the way, admitting faults starts at step 4, does it not? In fact, probably at step 3 when we're asked to consider the idea of a life run on self-will. And here, faults and ill feelings, just other descriptions of defects of character come up. First is we are still not too keen on admitting our faults, which implies we have to do that. If it was optional, we would be quite keen. We just wouldn't do it. But here we are not. We are still not too keen on admitting our faults. So there's a sense of you have to do this, and that's why you're probably not feeling keen. But you need to actually admit your faults. Now, what are our faults? If you go back to the resentments inventory, it's that a list of descriptions, of our flaws or shortcomings, lustful, self-centered, ego-driven, inconsiderate, dishonest. I tend to use those words with the people I make amends to. Back then, I was dishonest, I was inconsiderate, I was self-centered. And, again, the heads will nod, and there's something profound in letting that person know you've thought about this, you've done some work on this, and this is where you've arrived at. I know I was at fault, and here's the names of all those faults, which is reiterated in the second sentence here. We go to him, who are them, in helpful and forgiving spirit, confessing our former ill feeling. Well, ill feeling, fault, shortcomings, defects, it's all the same things. Where will we, and of course, this is the payoff for all the work we did at steps 4 and 5. This is one of the reasons why we do all that work. It's not just to learn about ourselves. It's so that we can share that learning in the process of clearing away the wreckage of our past. It's a wonderful system. Okay. The S stands for step 8, and I've already mentioned this. It kind of harks back to the A. It says in the big book, but our man, woman, or person is sure to be impressed with a sincere desire to set right the wrong. So this is, of course, what we're asked to do at step 8 and why it's so integrated to step 9. Hey, I'm in AA. At step 8, we're asked to make a list. You're on it because I feel I've harmed you. You may not see it that way, but, I am an alcoholic and I have to take this stuff seriously. My life is on the line. And I really do think, having done all of this, inventory, I did harm you, and I'd like a chance to at least explain why I think that. Is that okay? I've never had anyone say no to that. So, this idea of sincerely wanting to set right or wrong, as opposed to being scared of making the amends. This is what we need to pray for the willingness to do, to want to clear up the wreckage of our past, whether alcohol was directly involved or not. That is the entire point of steps 8 and 9. It'll bring us closer to God and closer to the comfort of being able to look behind, look at the past without wanting to drink over it. It's a profound set of steps. Now, part 2 is more about the specific issues that the big book mentions after this section, which talks about making a general amends to an enemy. We'll look at if you owe money, where don't you make an amends? Let's call it the situationally specific things that need to be considered, which will determine whether we do what we covered in part 1 or in fact leave that person alone, for example, or how you pay money back if that's something you need to do. See you then.